Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today to the Concentric Conference. Today, we have Sheri Byrne-Haber. Did I say that correctly, Sheri?
Byrne-Haber.
Byrne-Haber. I always see you on LinkedIn, but I don't have to pronounce it all. So
Yeah,
Sheri,
close enough. It's easy to mispronounce.
Gotcha. Sheri is a prominent global subject matter expert in the fields of disability and accessibility in the business and educational settings. She's best known for launching digital accessibility programs at multiple Fortune 200 companies, including McDonald's, Albertsons, and VMware, as well as consulting on government accessibility. Her programs have positively impacted millions of the more than 1 billion global people with disabilities. Just recently, about a week ago, she has put out a new book called Giving a Damn About Accessibility. It was published on Global Accessibility Awareness Day last week and is available for free at accessibility.uxdesign.cc. All right. Now, today, Sheri is going to talk with us about hiring for accessibility if you are not familiar with accessibility. So I'll give you the floor and turn off my camera, and we'll leave a little time for any Q&A at the end. It's yours, Sheri.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks, Randy. Appreciate you doing this. So like Randy said, I'm going to talk today about how to interview people for accessibility with a special emphasis on when the interviewer doesn't know a lot about accessibility themselves, what kinds of questions you should ask, what's important, how to analyze the candidate. So there's 4 intangible behaviors that are crucial for accessibility candidates, and none of them have anything to do with the actual testing process. So it's important to keep that in mind, and I like to think that this is true for basically all forms of quality assurance, because really what accessibility is it's just yet another form of regulatory compliance. Just like privacy, just like security, there are laws. You are testing to see whether the laws are met or not. Okay, but in order to be good at that, you have to be a creative problem solver. You have to really be able to keep calm in the face of chaos or fire drills. You need to have a lot of agility in terms of learning new material. And you need to be able to get things done through influence and persuasion. Because what you're doing is your candidates, if they are successful and get hired, they will find the bugs, but they have to convince other people that it's important to fix the bugs. So that's what the questions are going to focus on here. That is the mindset that I take. The other thing is that I won't talk in here anywhere about general interview techniques. Okay, so this is just specific to the accessibility piece. So what I do is I generally make a list of 5 to 8 questions, depending on the level of seniority, that I ask every single candidate. And I actually record the answers. I do this typically in a Word doc or an Excel spreadsheet, depending on how many candidates it is that I'm interviewing. And I do this so that I can do a very structured apples to apples comparison where I say, okay, this person gave me this answer, and I would grade this on a scale of 1 to 5 as a 4. This person on the same question, I didn't like their answer quite as much. It wasn't as thorough. I give them a 2. Then I add up all the points at the end. So I have a rank of the candidates from the highest number of points to the lowest number of points. And then I think about intangibles and tiebreakers and things that might convince me to choose one candidate over another after looking at where they scored on the point scale. So the very first thing I always start with accessibility testers is why accessibility? There is no wrong answer, but it will provide insight into the candidate's motivation for moving into accessibility. Now, you can't, and remember this, can't, shouldn't, don't inquire about medical conditions. The person may disclose, oh, I do accessibility testing because I have attention deficit disorder. That's fine. They're allowed to say that, but you're not allowed to ask the question, do you have any disabilities that led you to coming into this field? But it's important to understand where they're getting their empathy from. Is it because they have a sibling with a disability? Is it because their best friend, was deaf, for example? I've heard that before. So it's really good to understand where the motivation is coming from. And typically, I will always start with this question just to get things warmed up. Then the next thing we do is we go into the accessibility credentials. Now, if you have somebody who's in talent acquisition helping you out with this, potentially they could get this information for you during the screening process. And then you don't have to ask this question during the interview because you don't want to make your poor candidate repeat everything that they've already told somebody previously. There are 4 now, or actually 5 certifications that you can get from IAAP, but the 3 most common that you're going to see are the CPACC, Certified Professional Accessibility Core Competencies, the WAS, which is the Web Accessibility Specialist, and the CPWA, which is somebody who has both of the first 2. There's a new one that they just added called ADS, which stands for Accessibility Document Specialist. So if you are looking for somebody who can fix your PDF files, for example, that would be a credential that you would be very interested in. You want to find out if they have certifications in screen reader usage. There are 2 available for the PC. One is from JAWS, and that comes from a company called Vispero, which was formerly Freedom Scientific. And then there's also an NVDA certification, which comes from NV Access in Australia. VoiceOver and Android do not have certification. So that may be something where if that's really important to you because they're going to be testing native apps, you could ask them to whip out their device and show you how they use it. And that will tell you pretty quickly whether or not they've got the accessibility skills that they claim to have. So there is a free certification program from the US federal government, and this is really important. This certification is the most important for overseas candidates. So let's say you're trying to hire an accessibility candidate in a low-cost country like Romania. You want to make sure that they know how to apply the US laws or the EU laws, depending on where you're located. So the 508 Trusted Tester certification is a free way to do that, but it is a significant time commitment. It takes between 80 and 120 hours to finish the program. You have to finish it within 90 days, and you can't be silent for more than 10 days. And there's a waiting list. So you go on the waiting list, eventually your spot comes up, they send you an email, they tell you you have to start the program within 10 days. Once you start the program, you have 90 days to finish it. So lots of little logistical gremlins that have to be done in order to do the 508 Trusted Tester certification program. Sorry, my insulin pump is beeping here. Okay, and then another certification which I have, which I enjoyed getting, and it started me in my career in accessibility, is there's a certified ADA coordinator certification from the University of Missouri in Columbia, and that combines both physical accessibility and you can take electives in digital accessibility. So that one is good to have as well. Okay, so a lot of accessibility experience is self-taught. There aren't that many formal college classes or programs. There are some non-credit classes and some boot camps, and it could be that the candidate hasn't been able to afford those. There's not very many that are free. So you need to explore this in a different way than you would when you think, okay, well, this person is coming to me with a bachelor's of science in computer science from Cal, so I know that they're good at certain things. So some of the insightful questions that I like to ask to explore people's verifications are, what is your favorite, fill in the blank, CSUN session, smashing article, accessibility newsletter. People who are in accessibility know what these things are, right? They know what CSUN is, they know what smashing is, they know who writes accessibility newsletters and where to get for them. Or if they've listed credentials, you can ask them, well, what did you learn while you were trying to get your trusted tester certificate, for example. Okay, then you can get to accessibility tools. It is important to know what tools a candidate has been exposed to, but you don't want to make a decision based on whether or not somebody has used the tool previously. And the reason is that tools are easy to teach. Somebody doesn't know the JAWS, send them to a class at Vispero. Somebody doesn't know VoiceOver, they can go through the tutorial and learn it on their own in a couple of hours. So it's important to know, because you want to make sure that you're building a team where you don't have all the same weaknesses across your team. But it's also important not to decide based on tools, because soft skills are much more important than hard skills. And soft skills are also much harder to acquire than hard skills. So I do put this question in here, but I don't make final decisions based on whether or not somebody knows how to use a particular tool. And in fact, I was a little bit upset when probably the best accessibility tester that I know didn't get a job that he really wanted. And the reason that they gave him was that he didn't know enough JAWS, which is a very particular screen reader. And that was what spurred me to start my blog, which will be 3 years this November. So it's really important not to decide based on whether or not somebody knows a particular tool. Okay, it is important to find about what their opinions are on various topics. Several of the W3C guidelines are subject to interpretation. You want to make sure that the candidate has a reasonable interpretation. So, for example, somebody who's been doing accessibility for a while probably has an opinion about things that should be in WCAG, WCAG, that aren't there. My pet peeve for a long time was about the keyboard focus indicator. Because I have glaucoma, it's really important to me that the keyboard focus indicator have a good contrast. And when the keyboard focus indicator guideline first came out, there was no contrast requirement. And then it got added later. Another one is, what do you think about ARIA Live Region? When would you use it? When would you avoid using it? Doesn't matter if you know the answer to that question or not. It only matters that the candidate can discuss it intelligently. You can always take the answers and run them by somebody who knows more about accessibility than you do. I always ask, how do you convince people who are against accessibility? That's important, because that involves telling people that they're wrong. And sometimes sending that message directly is usually not well received. And it's a matter of, how do you build influence to convince people to change their minds so that they invest time and money in accessibility to make it part of the product MVP. Okay, what if, that's a duplicate slide, apologies. Okay, the next section that I go into is coding and design analysis. So you can write, again, if you don't know anything about accessibility, you can write down the answers and run it by somebody who does. So for example, IAAP has a communications chat board with lots of accessibility professionals on it. So if you posted that you needed help deciding who gave you the best answer for this question, lots of people would probably volunteer to help you. So some questions that you might want to ask include things like, how do you code custom tabs to make them accessible? How do you make a map work optimally for both screen reader users and users without disabilities? And these questions are even more important if the candidate doesn't have the WAS certification. If they have it, you know that they've got a certain base level of knowledge because they passed that test. If they don't have it and they're claiming that they have equivalence based on experience, these are the kinds of questions that they should be able to answer. And if they can't answer them or they don't answer them well, that is probably going to be a soft spot in terms of their qualifications. If you're talking to design individuals, if it's a position that requires accessible design expertise, ask them which WCAG guidelines that they control within design and how designs should be handed off to developers to code. So they should give you answers like, well, we control colors and we control magnification breakpoints, but we don't control things like what gets announced when a link visually says, click here, but you want it to announce, click here to learn more about our Memorial Day savings. So that's a place where the designer would need to write instructions to the developer so that it would be coded correctly, because you can't represent it in the design comp, but you can communicate to the coder what it is that they're supposed to do with it. This is also a really good place to talk about universal and inclusive design classes and experience, because the core concept of universal and inclusive design is making it work for everybody, which means that it has to be accessible. A good thing to do when you're doing a portfolio review with a designer, when there's an accessibility component to it, is ask them what they would have done to make it accessible if it was in an environment where that work wasn't supported, or ask them what they wish they had done differently if it did get implemented, as opposed to just being a classroom project. So here's really important list, questions that you don't ask, okay? What's your greatest weakness? Terrible question. Everybody has a stock answer for it. Don't ask that. It doesn't provide robust information, and you don't want the candidate to feel forced to disclose a disability, that their weakness is, that they have autism, for example. And don't ask the candidate anything illegal. Don't ask them, their age, whether they have children. There's all kinds of questions in the US that if the candidate is not selected, that they could have a potential lawsuit against your organization or an EEOC complaint. So definitely don't ask about the disability. Don't ask about weaknesses. Don't ask them anything that's illegal, because that's not going to make people feel comfortable about going to work for your organization. Just for knowledge purposes, about 30% of people in accessibility, in the accessibility field, have a disability. So that survey just was recently updated by WebAIM, WEBAIM for the captioner. And that's probably about a 10 times higher rate than you see in the general population of a workforce. So chances are, when you're interviewing people for an accessibility position, 1 in 3 of those candidates has a disability. Okay, so just to recap a little bit, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of articles about questions that are good for interviewing in general. I've only covered the pieces that are specific to accessibility. And there was a case called Gomez versus GNC, where they said it was really important that accessibility people, or people who were working in the accessibility field, actually had real accessibility knowledge. So in this particular case, the IT manager claimed to have accessibility knowledge, but the extent of his accessibility knowledge was going to a couple of webinars and thinking that he was good at something when he really wasn't. And so the court in that case actually threw out all of the IT manager's testimony, because they said he was not qualified as an accessibility expert. That is just the absolute kiss of death for a lawsuit is to have your expert testimony thrown out. So it is important that you make sure that your accessibility people are qualified. Another way to go about doing that is to use some, if not all, accessibility subcontractors through agencies where they're doing this type of checking for you. So for example, if you're hiring somebody from Level Access or from HCL, or you're going to a crowdsourcing organization like Applause or Digivanti, they've done all of the qualification analysis for you. So you pay them the contract rate, they come do your project, and when they're done, they're done. So I'd be happy to answer questions if anybody wants to follow up on any specific accessibility interview things that they've run into in the past.
All right, folks, now is your chance to ask some Q&A. I don't see anything currently in the Q&A or chat, but I am monitoring them both. Are there any questions you would have about bringing the right form of accessibility professional into your organization?
Or any general accessibility questions, I'm happy to answer that as well. I'm easy to find. Oh, okay.
It says, this is from Deanna, says, will accessibility become a mandatory skill in UX?
You know, I'd like to think that it would. We have, US is a very litigious society. So if you look at the charts from usable.net, we've seen an increase in accessibility litigation over the years. Last year with the pandemic, even with the courthouses being closed, the number went up by like 40% from the previous year. I think there were something like 3,500 accessibility lawsuits filed in the US. Accessibility is listed in all Microsoft, Google, and Yahoo job descriptions, coding descriptions as an important skill. Eventually, especially when the European Accessibility Act finally kicks in 2025 and broadens what rules apply in the EU to accessibility, it's going to be increasingly difficult to avoid.
Gotcha.
So I'd like to see colleges teaching it. It's just not happening yet, unfortunately, not on any type of broad scale. I do teach accessibility at a couple of boot camps. So I found some boot camps that are interested in it.
That leads right into Meryl's question. She says, do you know of an accessible UX training program?
Do I know of an accessible UX training program?
Or do you mean like an accessibility UX training program?
Maybe Meryl can clarify that. Yeah,
I wasn't sure if it was that she thought accessible as in one that is good for people with accessibility needs, I think is where she's going with this.
So there are probably, not surprisingly, very, very few people with disabilities in the design field. For example, it's really hard to have vision loss and be a designer, because if you can't see the colors, that's going to be a problem for choosing the colors.
And here it has to do with hearing loss, somebody who has hearing loss.
Right, Meryl has hearing loss, so captions usually take care of that, but all of the design tools are just absolutely miserable for accessibility. Miro is inaccessible, Figma is inaccessible. Who did I leave off? Miro, and Figma. None of those are accessible. They are all working on accessibility, but they're not accessible. So it's going to be a while until those products are accessible, and then maybe it will start to attract people with accessibility needs into that field. But right now it is pretty difficult because of the lack of accessible tools options. There are some accessible surveying options for people who are working in user research. So the 4 that I know of are Qualtrics, Google Forms, Microsoft Forms, and SurveyMonkey. Those are the 4 I usually recommend. Anything else, all bets are off.
All right. Any more questions before we wrap up, folks? Whether it's about accessibility or getting the right folks on your team for accessibility. We are getting
Hey, just to follow up on Meryl's comment, which only went to the panelists, don't assume because somebody has a disability that they actually know everything that there is to know about that disability. You know, you get an entire spectrum. So for example, for hearing loss, you can get people with congenital hearing loss, with acquired hearing loss. My daughter has a moderate to profound hearing loss, but it's congenital. So she's adapted really well. Somebody who wakes up one morning and can't hear out of one ear, they look at hearing as something that they had that they lost. It's a completely different psychological perspective, and it's also a completely different adaptation process. So you can't assume that one person represents all people. You know, some people sign, some people use captions, some people use re-speakers. So for example, if you're speaking with somebody with an accent, you have somebody that repeats what the person with the accent is saying, so the person with hearing loss can understand them more clearly. Likewise with mobility, some people use walkers, some people use canes, some people use wheelchairs. It's just all over the place. So you want to try to get, and just because you know stuff about physical access doesn't mean you know digital access. Just because you understand hearing loss doesn't mean you understand vision loss. So you really need to find people with a broad spectrum of both lived experience, but actually people who've gone out and to acquired knowledge about other people's disabilities as well.
Gotcha. All right. Is there anything that I might have missed in the comments or any more questions, or are we ready to call it a day? I think we're good. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. Hopefully see some of you guys tomorrow at some of the sessions. And thank you again, Sheri. Have a great one.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.